one of the people who were very instrumental to us starting the book festival, so I will always be grateful for you, Bob. There we go. So without further ado, I would like to turn things over to Bob, and I think you're in for a real treat. I will give you a insider's piece of information. Some of the best conversations are when people know each other very well and have collaborated before, and these two have quite a history, I think. So please take it away. Thank you.
We do have a history. I first published a story by Joyce Carol Oates in my quarterly Salmagundi in 1967. We became friends in 1970, so we've known each other a very long time. We've had many conversations, and I welcome this opportunity to ask her some questions that I think I've actually never asked her before. The first one, Joyce, excuse me for not looking directly at you, I'm using this microphone. The first one has to do with a word that we often hear invoked all over the place. The word is empathy. Recently I read an essay by a sort of eminent scholar at Columbia University named Sadiya Hartman, who said that empathy is the most difficult and slippery, right, of sentiments. And I began to think about what a writer of fiction does with empathy. Joyce, do you think, filled with empathy for all of your characters? Is it possible to be empathetic about a perfectly awful character that you've created? Do you feel empathy for that? Does Shakespeare feel empathy for Iago in Othello? Anyway, our first question.
Well, it's a very interesting question because, of course, we usually just begin writing with telling stories, and many of us began writing when we were very young, so there wasn't any sense of a motive or a consciousness or any kind of theoretical, underlining to what we did. I mean, most people are breathless. They tell stories to one another, and they say, "Have you heard?" In this air of something thrilling and dramatic. And so when you're telling a story, there's a certain momentum. Of course, then when you're writing a story, it's composed and much more calculated and calibrated. But I think basically it's the same momentum of storytelling. So characters in my stories don't seem to me necessarily like characters. They're more what happened. You spoke of Iago. Well, Iago is part of that drama. So I would guess that Shakespeare felt a tremendous dramatic excitement. Every time Iago appears, there's a little pulse beat, there's a rush of adrenaline in the play because he is the prime mover of the play. Without him, it would be like a happy play. So I think it's more of a sense of the quickening of a pulse of a drama. And the word empathy is in some ways like an artificial kind of consciousness. We're not really thinking about it. You don't feel that you have empathy for your wife or your children. It's a kind of spontaneous, intuitive feeling. So that's a kind of an overly cautious way of answering that. I identify with the characters to some extent. And if I'm telling a story in which somebody appears as a kind of villain or someone whom somebody else would think of as negative, that's part of the pulse beat of the story. And without that person, the story doesn't exist.
Very helpful. About a week ago, I read in an article on the German writer W.G. Sebald, something that he said about the Holocaust and writing about the Holocaust. He said, and I'm going to quote it, that only from Jewish writers who had actually experienced the Nazi death camps, can we get any real insight into the experience of the victims? Close quote. That struck me as an extraordinary idea, and as I began to think about it in connection with our conversation this afternoon, I wondered what you made of that. I mean, of the notion that real insight can only come from writers of a particular ethnicity or background who have actually experienced for themselves what they are writing about. It would seem to me that, well, I can't imagine that, for example, Joyce Carol Oates has an intimate experience of many of the things that are evoked in your fiction. Anyway, what do you make of that?
Well, it's a somewhat startling quote.
It is, isn't it?
Did he say only Jewish writers?
Yeah.
But there were non-Jews who perished also.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe he wasn't exactly thinking through what he. I mean, maybe there would have been more to it if he thought a little longer. Sometimes quotations are taken out of context, you know. I mean, obviously there were, for instance, gay people who were who were sent to death camps, and their insight would be just as legitimate. And there were Jewish people who were not particularly Jewish, but more secular Jews who would have another perspective. So therefore, it's a little bit hard to answer that. Sebald is such a fascinating person now, and now with this new biography, which I've only read about and maybe read reviews, now we know more about him. It's really kind of, I don't know what to say. Oscar Wilde said that biography lends to death a new terror. Because I guess anyone who reads that biography is going to think less of Sebald than they thought of him before they read it. And yet the books remain the same. It's kind of a paradox, you know. We don't know a good deal about Shakespeare, and there are many other writers we know very little about, and they're very high, you know, in the stature. If we knew a lot about them, like Andy Warhol kind of minutiae of vulgarity and, you know, every little detail, then probably they would diminish a bit. So it's good not to know too much. But I think what Sebald is such an eloquent writer himself that it would really depend upon the ability of the prose to communicate the insight. Somebody might have profound insight who is a first-hand witness, but not have the language and could not really express that. Cynthia Ozick wrote a wonderful story called The Shawl, which meant you've probably read. It's only about 5 or 6 pages long. Cynthia was not in a death camp, and she did not do the march that leads to the story. And yet I can't imagine a more evocative and powerful, beautiful, terrifying story, and beautifully written, somewhere between prose and poetry. And I wonder what Sebald would think about a work like that.
No, and yeah, the Ozick thing is a miracle, partly because it's so short, as you say. When I read that quotation from the new Sebald biography, I was actually teaching Sebald's novel Austerlitz in a class, and Sebald is a writer who, was not in a death camp. He was a German. He was born in 1944, and he didn't go through that experience, and he wrote all of these novels which evoked the experience of the Holocaust. So it seemed like a very strange thing to have said. A very different sort of question. A very admiring reviewer, considering all that you've done for the art of the novel over decades, wrote not too long ago that your books have virtually nothing to do with the following. This is a quote. The irony princes in the literary clubhouse. And I'm not sure exactly what that means, irony princes in the clubhouse, but I'm curious enough to ask what you make of that. Are you, as a writer, as this very admiring reviewer suggests, largely indifferent to the seductions of irony as a stance in your fiction? Do you think?
No, I would say probably my writing is deeply ironic, but I don't know what that means. The statements are sort of like puzzles or cones or riddles, you know. Maybe because I'm a woman.
Maybe.
Is it Prince?
I don't remember who is the guy who is in there.
But the idea that princes,
Princes, yes.
Is it-
Princes in the clubhouse, yes.
so Prince is a masculine,
Yeah,
so, well,
yeah,
no, I think I'm probably more ironic than I should be.
yeah. I can't resist the temptation to ask you about something many of my students have been asking me about over the last year. You and I corresponded about it a little bit a while back. It has to do with the Blake Bailey biography of Philip Roth, which was, many of you perhaps read about this, which was withdrawn, canceled by its publisher, W.W. Norton, because of perfectly plausible allegations about the ugly misdemeanors of the biographer, Blake Bailey. This seemed to some of us rather an extraordinary thing for a major publisher to do, not because the allegations about the biographer were not appalling, but because the criticism didn't have anything to do with the book, with the biography itself. So I thought to ask you what you make of this. I don't know, is it in fact, do you think, a large tendency in the culture to cancel books or films because of the charge brought against their authors or directors? Again, this is not a charge against the film, not a charge against the book, charge against the author or director. Very different things, I think, but anyway.
Well, in that particular case, it may have been a sort of public relations move on the part of the publisher to withdraw the book. But I think the book was then sold to another smaller publishing house.
Yes.
So it didn't really go out of print, and it was always available.
Yes.
It almost seems like a gestural ritual or something, like you pretend to punish this person, but it's just all a rite, some sort of a magic rite, you know. But I don't think it's ever a good idea to cancel a book, because for one thing, a book is not just its author. In this case, the book has an editor, there are people on the staff working at the publishing house, there's the art director, and then there are the booksellers, who probably had the book all up in like a pyramid, you know, and then you have to take it down, you know. All these people are part of the book culture.
Yeah.
So it seems really wrong to cancel. And the same thing is probably true of anything, you know, to suddenly cancel. If you don't want to read or buy the book, then just don't do it. You know, there's a sort of individual boycott. Many writers feel there's sort of a just implicit boycott of their work in a sense, because people are not rushing to buy it. So that's the usual state, is people are not rushing to buy something. If you're a poet, you know, you don't get mobbed by people wanting your autograph, so you don't have to cancel a poet, you know, so. But it was a very lurid and fascinating story that played out in the press like so much these days.
Yeah, and you mentioned that the biography, which was withdrawn by Norton, was picked up by a small publisher and issued, so that the book is still available. So, you know, when I was talking about it with a few of my students, they said, well, so it's not a big deal. And I said, well, actually that was a book that had a $600,000 advance when it was published. It had already sold hundreds of thousands of copies. If I had been, Bob Boyers, if I had been the author of my own book, those allegations had come out about me, and my publisher had withdrawn my book, it would not have been reissued by another publisher. So it would have been effectively canceled. And so then that's the issue, really. You know, if you've got a major book, if you're a major author, or if you've written a major book, then there are possibilities, you know, around the cancellation, but not everybody would be so fortunate to have that happen. Well, let me ask you a very different sort of question, Joyce. You've explained, and I think this is something that lots of people here will probably be very interested in, that your practice has long been to write a novel, put it aside for a while, work on other projects, and then come back to the manuscript with a fresh eye for revision and polishing. Occasionally, you put aside a novel, I think this is only once, for as long as 30 years. This all makes sense to me, though I wondered if you'd speak about what it is like for you to return to a book after a long time, maybe not 30 years, but say 2 or 3 years. What do you discover when that happens?
Well, I think of being put aside, anything we write for a while, it could be just a few months, but a year or two, and then you reread it. You know, you reread it as a reader. So the pacing is the reader's pacing rather than the writer's. So it's a completely different experience. Because when I'm writing, which I'm doing, like today I was writing just a little while ago, it's so slow. Like I'm working on a sentence and then suddenly it gets to be like 2 sentences. Then there's a paragraph, then I decide I don't like it, so I'm doing the whole thing over again. Then I kind of go back to some other page and then I do that again because I don't like that so much. So it's like you go 2 steps forward, 3 steps backward, and it's such a, almost like a mosaic. It's like hobbling along on 2 crutches and 1 leg or something. So, but then when you're reading it, you sort of sit in a chair rather than at your desk, and you just sort of read it. Ideally, you should have a cat with you. So the cat will purr, or the cat will fall asleep if things aren't so interesting. But then, and then maybe making notes or just reading it. So that's so helpful. I try to suggest to my students that they do that. When they write something, it's in this fever pitch of excitement, and sometimes writing, you know, for many hours at a time. Young people can write all night long, you know, just some like flames. But then you put that aside because it's so exuberant and exciting. It might be too long. It might be more like a stream of consciousness, and you'll need to organize it. So at a certain point, I see the organizational possibilities that really there are like 3 parts to the novel. It came out all in one stream, you know, but then you start to see that by stepping back. It's very helpful. The example of 30 years was so weird. I can't even believe that happened. It just seems so strange to me. I was working on a novel a long time ago, before some people were even born, and I finished it, and it was all finished, and it was part of a trilogy or a quartet of novels, of Gothic novels. So I was exploring 19th century America, early 20th century America from the point of view of Gothic, modernist Gothic, experimental literature, and it was really lots of fun. But I didn't feel that I really had the key to this novel called The Crosswicks Horror. So I put the whole manuscript, we're talking about a big manuscript, I put it in another room in the house. And then every once in a while, like a few months later, I would go in and look at it. And I thought, well, maybe something has happened, maybe it's gotten a little better. And I start reading it, and I have an initial thrill of excitement, and then it died out, you know, like about page 4. And I said, well, I'll put that aside, you know, I'm working on something else. Then literally years went by, and every once in a while I would go in and I'd start rewriting it. And I'd write like 12 pages, and then it would die out again, and put it back. And I've never had an experience like that. So it just was so odd in my life. But then, after the election of Obama, something clicked. because the novel's about race in America. It's not really much at all about black people. It's about the failure, very purposeful failure of white Christian ruling class to do anything about racism, focused a bit on New Jersey and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and that sort of thing. But it's basically about the white ruling class, exemplified by Woodrow Wilson in my novel, who they just literally turn a blind eye. I mean, Woodrow Wilson just doesn't do anything. The church fathers, the leaders of society, they could have done so much to dissociate themselves from these awful racists over here, sort of around, you know, in the periphery of their vision, who are doing the Ku Klux Klan and actually murdering and lynching. But the ruling class just didn't really do anything. If you look at the history of it, it's very sordid and very, very awful. So my novel is called The Accursed, and I rewrote every sentence of it with a new consciousness that no matter how racist the society was, at the time of Obama, which is when I was living at that time, it all had kind of come around in a circle, and that this racism had been confronted. And there are lots of jokes too about Woodrow Wilson was a racist. He was also a sexist and an anti-Semite and lots of other things, but still he was a reformer. That gives you an idea what things were like. Woodrow Wilson was a reformer, but at the same time he was all these other things. He was the president of Princeton University at the time of my novel, which is 1906. I'm sorry to go on at such length, but what happened was I found the key to writing the novel, so I rewrote every sentence in it, but I didn't change any characters, and the plot's the same. Literally everything is exactly the same, but all the language was different. So it was so much fun. I just wish I could have that experience again. And I wasn't even that well. I remember I had the flu or something, so I was like lying in bed. I was so exhausted and sick. But whenever I wrote in the novel on my laptop, I would just get kind of thrilled and excited. It was very invigorating. But that's an unusual situation, to put something aside that long.
Recently, about 2 years ago, I read and loved your 2019 novel called My Life is a Rat, which I don't know how many of you have read it, which revolves around the life of a young woman who, as a child, inadvertently informed on her own brothers, right? And it's a very interesting and intricate novel. But I wanted to ask you about something on the acknowledgments page for that novel, in which you say that in its earliest form, this is a quote from the acknowledgments page, My Life as a Rat appeared as a short story called Curly Red in a 2003 Harper's Magazine. This question is somewhat related to the last one, but it's not the same. I'm going to ask you whether it is often the case that a short story you've written seems to you more or less at once, or maybe after a period of time, to have wanted to be a novel.
Well, I think in the case of Curly Red, it was a story I wrote very rapidly and with a lot of excitement, and the whole novel was actually incorporated in the story. Obviously, it was something like a first draft of what might have been a novel at that time, but it wasn't, and I'm glad it wasn't, because I think I made it better by just living longer, you know. But that once in a while we write short stories that have that kind of expansiveness and characters that might grow through time. So I think you can write a short story and delimit it, but then you can go back to something like that and make it much longer. That happened with another short story I wrote called Zombie. That was in the New Yorker, so I read it and I thought it was finished. Then I read it in print, which is another experience to read something in print, because it's sort of detached from you. And I thought, well, gee, this doesn't really end. it was sort of startling because it wasn't ended. You could sort of see that. And so I went back and I wrote the rest of it. So if that makes any sense, I think all these experiences are somewhat intuitive.
Yeah, no, it makes great sense. A little while ago, a few hours ago, I was at a poetry reading where one of the readers, April Bernard, who's a wonderful poet, spoke briefly about the fact that when she writes a poem, she shows it to a circle of people. And that's a regular, routine thing that she does. And I think you and I both know numbers of writers who do that. Poets and some fiction writers, in our experience, I think, do that. And I wonder, have you ever had that sort of impulse to, when you're working on a manuscript, maybe even before it's done, to show it to other people and sit around and talk about it? I mean, I know other writers who say, I would never do that.
Well, I do that with just a few people. Then, of course, it goes to my editor. But I think poets are more likely to do that.
Yeah.
I remember Robert Lowell and his circle sending their poems around because the poetry that they were writing was really almost in some sort of call and response to one another, John Barrowman and others, and so there was a kind of electric excitement. With prose writing, it's a little different because obviously a novel's rather long, and so to expect your friend to read your novel, it's very touching when they do. And mostly, I think people are very constructive. I mean, nobody ever says, "Oh, give up. This is the worst thing I've ever read." I mean, people are usually, they offer some sort of lame positive adjectives or something like interesting, But my first husband, Ray Smith, actually didn't read my work. He was an editor and publisher. He was an editor of a distinguished little literary magazine. And he had so much reading to do. He was reading all the time. He loved it, but he was working all the time, with his eyes, and he was editing and doing that. So I actually didn't show him my work, to just sort of give an 800-page novel to your poor struggling husband. It seemed too cruel. But people thought that was weird. But there are some wonderful literary marriages, and somebody should write a book about the literary marriages, because I won't embarrass people by saying who they are, but some friends of mine who are married to writers, they show each other everything they write, and they read it aloud to one another, which I think would really put us straight in some marriages. I could imagine doing that with my husband and seeing that he'd fallen asleep. But these literary marriage people, that they really, I can think of 3 examples actually. And then Joan Didion and John Gray McDonough evidently they did that also. But so there's somebody right in your own household who has your best interests at heart.
Yeah.
And so that can be very helpful.
Yeah, I was thinking of a couple of writers who taught Skidmore for a while, a married couple named Bharati Mukherjee and Clark Blaze.
Oh,
wonderful,
yeah.
wonderful, you knew them
Yeah.
very well. Wonderful writers. And in that literary marriage, Clark read and copy edited all of Bharati Mukherjee's work, and she never read any of his work.
Really? She
that was
never
just-
read?
Yeah, they were married for more than 40 years, but that was their arrangement.
Even after it was published?
Even when it was published. Arrangement. I mean, these are people we knew very well. They lived in Saratoga Springs. We had dinner with them twice a week for years and years, and this always struck us as kind of odd and in a way kind of wonderful that they managed to remain well married all of those years.
I think that's unusual, though. I think it's usually reciprocal. That I've never heard of anything like that.
Sorry, I couldn't resist that. Every now and then, when I teach your stories or a novel in my classes, I teach a course called Recent Fiction, I sometimes teach Joyce's work. And sometimes the students have read others of your work in other classes or just on their own. And we get to talking about a Joyce Carol Oates story or a Joyce Carol Oates novel, right? As if in some way there was, with all of these many stories and books, as if there was sort of characteristic work. And of course, I think all of us who've read numbers of books by Joyce, by Russell Banks, or other, we get a sense of what kind of writer we're dealing with here. But then sometimes people talk about their work as constituting one vast single body of work, all sort of coherent and integrated, however diverse all of the parts. Something like Balzac, for example, right? All 32 novels, but all somehow one. Do you ever think of your work as constituting like a vast single body of work, or is it all many different pieces?
Well, again, it's a very probing question. I think that most of us are so attentive to what we're doing at the moment. Writing, in some senses, is like solving problems. You have to solve the problem of the language and how a scene plays out. So there's less of sort of intense focusing and concentration on a problem right staring in front of you. It would be more for a critic or a biographer to sort of stand back and see this large mass. I would say in the case of my writing that there isn't any overview. I mean, there may be more of a coherent, like a sense of a terrain if you look at the work of Saul Bellow, how it begins sort of with these slender novels and then Augie March and then sort of going back to the slender novels. That Bellow has much more consistency of voice also, and maybe Roth. I try to have different mediated voices that express the sensibility of different characters. So I try not to have the same narrative voice, but I think you could always pick out anywhere pick out some sentences by Bellow. Yeah. And John Updike, and certainly James Joyce, Faulkner, Hemingway. There's a distinctive style, that like the Hemingway style, which can be parodied, but essentially it's very beautiful and it has this sense of something happening implacably and inevitably and irrevocably, sort of things happening and linked by the word and this and that and that. Whereas Faulkner will have a lot of sentences with lots of commas in it. Hemingway has almost no commas, but using commas and sort of going back into the past and coming around. But I try to vary sentences and I experiment with voice. So sometimes I have sentence fragments or even one word. I'm trying to do different things. But at the same time, I think probably somebody could say there is a Joyce sentence. I mean, they could just probably pick it out to my embarrassment. And a friend of mine said that I'm always writing about a canal. And I grew up near the Erie Barge Canal and near a creek, a Tonawanda Creek. And it's sort of like part of my whole brain is just by these streams of water. And I noticed my default setting is always by a river or a stream or a canal, sort of get my bearings that way. I should go back and take these out so it's not so predictable.
Your novels reflect, this is an obvious thing, a deep absorption in a very wide range of issues: cultural, racial, gender, political. The first book of yours that I wrote about 1,000,000 years ago was Them. Just a great novel. If you've not read it, you should read it. It goes way back. It won the National Book Award, and it's a great book. And of course, this has been true for so much of your work, that it engages with all of these kinds of issues. So I thought to ask, what, in your sense of it, differentiates your treatment of issues in a novel from a journalistic or a topical handling of such issues, racial issues or gender issues and so on. They're so different. I mean, if you read your novel and these issues are in the air, in the ether of the novel, it doesn't at all feel the way it does when you're reading a newspaper article or a magazine article.
Well, in prose fiction, we enter the story by way of characters. So they're people, and we're viewing what might turn out to be history through the perspective of some individuals, and that's where all our perspective is. We don't really ever experience, I think, objectively. I mean, it's our own experience. So yeah, obviously, prose fiction and poetry is the individual voice. And so whether what you're living through could be catastrophic or could be mundane, just domestic life, it's from that point of view of a real person, and we identify with these real people. But around the time of them, my whole life changed. And we don't talk enough or at all really about contingency and accident in the lives of writers. How something happens to you that's actually accidental, but from that point onward, your life takes a different turn, and it's just changed forever. So before I wrote them, I had never lived in a city. I had never lived in a large American city. I had come from a rural background, a not very prosperous farm. I mean, I loved my childhood on this fruit orchard farm in upstate New York, north of Buffalo. I come from a part of the world now where people say there is no north of Buffalo. I would live north of Buffalo. There's a whole Niagara County there. It's called the Snow Belt. I mean, to say that there's nothing north of Buffalo, it's just so kind of, outrageous. But anyway, that was my background. So I wrote a lot about rural people and things I had experienced or seen or people whom I knew. And in college, I read a lot of Kafka. I read Thomas Mann. I read James Joyce. And I was reading all these great writers, and Faulkner. Faulkner doesn't have any any urban novels either. And I was just writing always about a kind of ahistoric present. There's rural America, but not particularly rooted in a specific political time. It could be just like around the 1960s or 1950s, or it could have been 1930s. I mean, I didn't really have anybody president of the United States, and I tried to stay away from that kind of historical authenticity. But then, just by accident really, my husband and I moved to Detroit, and I was suddenly living in a big American city, a kind of quintessential American city with all the problems of America and a few of its own special problems also. But also in boom times, it was Motor City, USA, and there was a lot of affluence there for white people anyway. And I didn't really know it, but it was such a racially oppressive city for the black population, and I suppose for poor, and also for poor people, that I was not aware of that because the media didn't really disseminate that. Now we have social media, and you can pick up all sorts of grassroots videos and information from all around the country. Then we didn't have that. We had just newspapers that were mainstream, and we had maybe just a few television channels, but we had nothing like 24-hour cable news, and nothing like that existed. And so the only news that you got was sort of filtered through something like Cotton Bathroom, it was really all censored, I guess, looking back on it. So Ray and I were living in Detroit at the time of the civil disturbance that's called the Detroit Riot. That's not really the right term. It was an uprising against police brutality that was just outrageous. But the white population mostly didn't know about that, I don't think. And we were living right in the middle of this, just a few blocks away from looting and burning and fire sirens and smoke, and cowering in our house. And I taught at the University of Detroit, which is just about a mile away from some of this. So suddenly I was this girl from the country, sort of catapulted into a world where sirens and smoke and fire and the National Guard came in. And I just was totally, I suppose it was traumatizing in one way, but exhilarating in another, because my whole life has changed. So the novel Them is only written because of the accident of coming to Detroit. And I wrote for a long time only about Detroit. And even when I moved away, even recently, my next novel that's coming out called Babysitter is back in Detroit in the 1970s. Such a hallucinatory, haunted feeling. When I lived in England for a year, I would close my eyes and I could drive on the John Lodge Expressway, just drive in this way down these streets of Woodward Avenue. I'd sort of go around in my mind, And though I was living in London, one of the great cities of the world, I was still back in Detroit, and I wrote a novel set in Detroit while I was in London. That's the sort of crazy thing that writers do. Like, why wasn't I writing about London? I wrote almost nothing about London. I was sort of caught in this really, really powerful grip of Detroit. So the novel Them really springs out of that sense of being haunted by that. I wanted to try to understand why there would be the so-called Detroit riot. So I went back 2 generations instead of starting actually in another state and somebody who moves to Detroit. But I think that we don't talk enough about how things are accidental in our lives.
Well, I only have about 15 more questions that I've prepared. But I think we're at that moment where we can take some questions for Joyce Carol Oates. So if you have a question you'd like to ask it, and if you just step up to this microphone, that would be great. Anybody? It's not a problem. Oh yes, excellent.
I have a very silly question. I went to the Sandrof Writers Institute when you read one time several years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, when you were reading a story about a cat that went outside and disappeared, and they thought it was gone, and then it came back, and you left us on a cliffhanger, and I never knew the name of the story. Do you remember what you read about a cat?
Well, it was a little different than that. That's one of the chapters in Night, Sleep, Death, and the Star. It was a feral cat, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a feral cat who comes to the back door of somebody's house. Yeah, that was from Night, Sleep, Death, and the Stars. The cat's name was Mac the Knife. And he was a very feral, a very ferocious, but ultimately very tender and sweet, as they all are, tomcat. Well, thank you for remembering.
I'm going to go back and get it.
Thank you for remembering that, but it's really sort of an allegory. That's a bad word, but the cat is like a symbol. This woman is a widow, and the cat represents like the wildness or some possibility of her life that she doesn't recognize. And later on in the novel, people, like her own children, want to take this cat away and have it euthanized because it's such an awful cat. It bites and scratches. And she says, and they say, well, we can give you a nice cat. There are a lot of these rescue cats and kittens. And she thinks, well, I don't want a nice cat. I want the cat that came to my back door. That's how we all feel.
Yes, thank you.
Joyce, very few literary writers explore genre and take on genre the way you have, and sort of slip into the skin of various genres as an experimenter in a way. And I wonder if you could talk about that. You mentioned Gothic novel, crime novels, and you experiment with all of these kinds of voices and tones.
Yes, I'm very interested in genre. It's a way of experimentation. I think if you take certain forms, like if you're a poet working with a sonnet, taking the classical Shakespearean sonnet, you can do such interesting and unusual things with it. So too with the mystery, suspense, thriller genre is the one that interests me, because how do you end it? Now in the classic genre endings, everything has to be explained and clear. That's a sort of contract with the reader, I think. But if you're exploring it from a more literary perspective, how can you make that happen while still making it literary? In the sense it's not overwhelmingly obvious, it's more subtle. A good example would be Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, which is perhaps the greatest ghost story ever written, and yet maybe there are no ghosts in it. It gives you the possibility that things are imagined by the protagonist. But it's so interesting because Henry James is such a great writer, so we're kind of barreled and drawn along by the narrative itself. So what I'm working on right now is a sort of mystery thriller genre, and it's very challenging and exciting to me because I know the ending. I have a lot of feelings about ghost stories and what it is to be haunted. I feel that we are literally haunted by memories. We can't help memories and dreams. And so we're haunted by certain figures out of the past. And so writers want to write about that. And so you could make that seem to be a real ghost, like glimpse through a mirror or something. You can make it seem to be a real ghost in the Gothic genre. If it's realistic psychological fiction, you probably wouldn't make it seem like a real ghost, but it could be something that somebody almost sees, that you sort of see something. People see in other people ghosts of other people. In other words, it's said that if you've had a battered and painful, traumatic childhood, or a relationship with a lover, you will be looking around in the world not to escape that, but to replicate it again. That women who've been badly treated by men are drawn very much unconsciously back to that same kind of man. And it's not known exactly why they do it. I think it may be one of the reasons that we're drawn back is we want to make it right this time. This time we want to make it right. Or maybe we feel we should be punished. And so we're drawn back to that cycle of being hurt and wounded again. But I think the phenomenon of ghost stories about werewolves and vampires, when you deconstruct them, they're just, I think, very, very real psychologically, very, very powerful. Thank you. Great question.
You've been writing for a really long time. What inspired you at the beginning to start writing, and then what's kind of keeping you going today?
What's keeping me going? That's such a good question. It's sort of like the cat, the mother cat has come out with another litter. I said, well, gosh, did you really have to have 99 kittens? We would have been happy with 3 kittens. Fortunately, it's like dreaming. Like we don't really think, well, I've had 1,000 dreams, 10,000, 100,000 dreams. We just sort of are engrossed in the dream every night. I mean, I know I am. Sometimes the dreams are very frightening, but they're also very, very powerful. So we're not really thinking about the preceding dreams. It's like what you're doing right now. And when I first started writing, I was very young. I was just a child, so I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, not that I ever really know what I'm doing, but I had tablets and I was drawing pictures of chickens and cats, really, and I couldn't write yet. I had to wait a while before I was able to write. But my first efforts, let's say, as sort of like War and Peace on the farm, with chickens and cats, and page after page of these figures, but I don't know what they were doing. My mother used to save all those incriminating things. And for years when interviewers came to the farmhouse to talk to my parents, my mother, to my great embarrassment, she would take out all these old things, these coloring books, and little things I had scribbled. I don't know what's become of them. I don't want to think they're in my archive. But anyway, we all start writing when we're so young. We don't have any motives or any clear reason for what we're doing.
Yes, sir.
Recently, I've come across, by happenstance, a number of articles and even books about Madonna. And, you know, my memory of Madonna, what I like best is Don't Cry for Me, Argentina, and Desperately Seeking Susan. I don't know if they're a movie brother, but. And I'm thinking of your book, Blondie, which is about Marilyn. And we all kind of have lived through, we're old enough to have lived through the history of both of these characters. And, but sometimes it seems we can't express the history that we've lived through. We don't maybe think of it enough. And I wonder if you could comment on these two personalities and the changes and what's happened to us as a culture, I guess.
What a profound question, especially the last part of it. Well, I don't know anything at all about Madonna, so I can't comment on her. But Marilyn Monroe really came to me as a subject to write about when I saw a photograph of Norma Jean Baker when she was only 16. It was just a little photograph in a book, and she had brunette hair, and she was very, very sweet. She was a high school girl. I guess she dropped out, and she soon got married. But I wasn't really interested in Marilyn Monroe as the icon or the Andy Warhol kind of vulgar, mass-produced image, but more like a girl. She reminded me of my own mother at that age, and the pictures of my mother that I'd seen, and girls I went to school with, and from a really impoverished background. But she was very, very pretty, and yet not beautiful or glamorous. She was just a very hopeful. There was a kind of hope in her face even then. So I learned more about Norma Jean Baker, and when I wrote my novel, it begins with her it actually begins with her posthumously, and she's looking at the movie of her life, but then the early chapters are about the child. And she had a mother who could really hold her, and her father never acknowledged her. So Norma Jean Baker becomes the blonde actress, sort of the iconography of everything that's desirable, sexually desirable and unattainable, and yet to herself she was always Norma Jean, and she really ended up, I think, very much alone and isolated. And people who made a lot of money on her, they're still making money, mostly all men. I mean, they just all made millions and millions of dollars, but she didn't.
Other questions? We have just a few minutes. Yes, there's one. Yes.
You write so much. How do you discipline yourself? Like I kind of like not have your daily work.
Well, I think of writing as, I do a lot of running and walking. I try to run every day. And when I'm running, I feel very exhilarated and very happy. And then if I can't run, I walk very fast. So I start to tell the stories then, and I kind of work on my writing while I'm moving around. And so that would be part of my work day, is actually when I'm not sitting at the desk. So when I actually go to a desk to take notes or to write, it could be a very small amount of the time I've spent on it. And if you're writing a novel, it's good to get the whole thing in your head by doing really long walks, just walking alone, and trying to tell the whole story in your head, and almost spatially, like you're seeing a movie. Get the whole story, the beginning, the middle, but particularly the ending, and get it kind of all like a movie that you've seen, so you have it in your head. And then when you're writing page after page, you always have that sense of the whole there. And all this takes some time. So sometimes I think my work starts in the very early morning. I'm wakened rather rudely by a cat who wants breakfast, but it's only 5:30 in the morning, and it's dark, you know. But anyway, the schedule is just embarrassingly awful schedule that I have. But as I try to lie in bed with my eyes shut Because as soon as you open your eyes, then your consciousness alters. But if you keep your eyes shut, you can sort of focus on your work and just sort of think about it for a while. So that might begin the day. And then later on, when you're actually writing, I start getting a lot of energy around late afternoon, and then I work till about 8:30, and then I stop for dinner usually. But I have to have the whole day. I think about it. Sometimes I get very excited, and might start writing. I might start at 10 a.m. or I might start at 1 or 2 p.m. But it's all sort of starts early in the morning. I hope that people all do this. It's just called meditation, I think.
Last question. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Do you have any advice for having me a better reader?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I don't know how to answer that. I read in different ways. Sometimes I read pretty rapidly, but if I'm reading something that I really like a lot, I actually have a pencil, and I usually have paperbacks, and I underline or make notes in the margins. And I do a lot of rereading. So the pacing, I think, depends upon to what kind of commitment you're making. I read student work twice, and I read it on a laptop. My students are mainly writing novels, so I kind of read their work pretty carefully, and then I let a couple of days go by. Then I read it again, and take notes and so forth. But I wouldn't do that with most of my writing.
Thank you, Joyce Carol Oates.